James Miller stepped into his quiet suburban house, a feeling of deep satisfaction washing over him as he hung his keys on the small hook by the door. The sun was dipping low, and the rich aroma of Laura's lasagna drifted enticingly from the kitchen. Echoes of laughter floated down the hall, the unmistakable sound of Sophie and Liam cracking up over some shared joke. James's lips curled into a quiet smile. This is why I do what I do, he thought, easing off his suit jacket with a sigh of relief. A warm home, a joyful family, and a meal made with love. Everything, at least on the surface, seemed just right. In the dining room, 12-year-old Sophie was showing her younger brother, Liam, how to fold a crane out of a scrap piece of paper. She tossed her long brown hair to one side and let out a playful groan as Liam once again scrunched the paper into a ball. "No, like this, goofball," she said between giggles. Liam furrowed his brow in fierce concentration, tongue poking from the corner of his mouth. James leaned against the doorway, quietly watching them with warmth in his eyes. Sophie had inherited Laura's vivid green eyes and that determined look she wore when focused. Liam, all tousled dark curls and cheeky grin, reminded James so much of himself at that age. They meant the world to him. Laura emerged from the kitchen holding a hot dish, her blonde hair loosely pinned, cheeks pink from the oven's heat. To James, she was effortlessly beautiful, just as breathtaking as the day they'd exchanged vows 14 years ago. "Perfect timing, love," she said with a bright smile. "Dinner's on." She placed the lasagna down on a trivet, the scent enveloping the room, and looked up at him with a gaze that still made his heart beat faster. In that instant, James was flooded with affection and appreciation. Despite the stress of his role as a financial analyst and Laura's juggling of family life and her part-time interior design gigs, they always made time to sit down together for dinner. These evenings were sacred. The family gathered around the table. James took his usual seat at the head, Laura beside him, the kids opposite. As Laura dished out generous servings of the bubbling pasta, Sophie began a lively recap of her day, proudly declaring her math quiz triumph, and recounting how a boy in her class had his hoodie caught in the door, sparking a fit of laughter among her classmates. Liam, never one to be left out, added exaggerated sound effects and wild gestures to amplify his sister's tale, making everyone laugh. James reached out to squeeze Laura's hand, exchanging a knowing smile over the joyful chaos. To him, this was happiness, a loving partner, cheerful kids, and calm after the daily grind. After dinner, they moved to the living room, a cozy space filled with warm colors and thoughtful decor, unmistakably Laura's touch. They gathered on the couch to watch a short episode of the kids' favorite show. Sophie curled up against James's side while Liam stretched out on the rug, eyes glued to the screen. Laura sat on the other end of the sofa, legs tucked beneath her. James caught her gaze and found her already looking at him with a soft, peaceful smile. In that unspoken moment, his heart swelled. How did I get so lucky? He wondered. Laura's lips curved subtly before she turned her attention back to the screen. When the show ended, bedtime routines began. Despite a few half-hearted groans, Sophie and Liam gave goodnight hugs to both parents. James scooped Liam up, arms outstretched like airplane wings, zooming him down the hall with buzzing noises, sending the boy into fits of laughter. Sophie followed behind, rolling her eyes with mock annoyance, though the corners of her mouth betrayed a grin. Once Liam was tucked in and Sophie reminded not to stay up too late on her tablet, James gently closed their doors. He lingered in the hallway, listening as Laura softly hummed a lullaby beside Liam's bed, a tender tradition she'd kept since they were babies. The tune was gentle, and James felt his heart ache with contentment. This was the life he had always hoped for. Later that night, James stepped into the master bedroom, loosening his tie as he exhaled a weary sigh. From the partially open door of the ensuite bathroom, he caught a glimpse of Laura finishing her skincare routine. Wiping off makeup and patting on moisturizer, the light catching the diamond on her wedding ring. Sitting on the edge of the bed, James picked up a framed photo from the nightstand. His favorite shot from last summer's beach trip. Laura, glowing in a flowy sundress and sun hat, stood beaming with Sophie and Liam at her sides, while James stood behind them, arms wrapped around his family, all of them laughing at something off-camera. They looked carefree, untouched by worry. What more could a man want, he thought. He gently set the picture down and began unfastening his shirt, a small smile tugging at his lips. In the stillness of the night, with the children finally asleep and the house wrapped in quiet, James first noticed it, a low, tense voice coming from the bathroom. At first he assumed Laura was speaking to him, but her tone was hushed, urgent, more like someone on a secretive phone call. He paused midway through undressing, one sock in hand, ears straining. "I miss you too," Laura murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. James's brow furrowed. Who was she talking to in such an intimate tone this late at night? Then he caught the faint hum of another voice, muffled but clearly responding. She must have answered her cell. Curiosity stirred, though he wasn't yet alarmed. He stayed frozen, unwilling to intrude if it was something personal. Then came her voice again, softer now, almost conspiratorial. "No, he doesn't know a thing." "Yes, I swear. Tomorrow, same time, same place. I'm counting the hours." A chill rippled through James. He doesn't know a thing. The sock slipped from his fingers and fell unnoticed to the floor. There was a brief pause before she spoke again, this time with a gentler edge. "I love you." The floor creaked beneath James as he shifted, and in an instant, the conversation stopped. A heartbeat later, the bathroom door eased open. Laura stepped out, phone still in hand, and jumped slightly when her eyes met his across the bedroom. "Oh," she said too brightly, masking her surprise with a casual smile. "I didn't hear you come in." James forced his expression into neutrality, though his thoughts spun wildly. A cold prickle crawled up his spine. "Who were you talking to?" he asked, nodding at her phone. For a split second, something flickered in Laura's eyes. Panic? But just as quickly it was gone, replaced with an easy grin. "Melanie," she said smoothly, naming her sister without hesitation. "She was just reminding me about our parents' anniversary next week. You know how she gets. She can talk forever." She laughed lightly, slipped her phone into her pocket, and walked over to him. Pressing a quick kiss to his cheek, she added, "Sorry if I woke you." James let out a small, forced chuckle. "No worries," he said, though something inside him had tightened. She smelled the same as always, sweet vanilla and the floral perfume he knew by heart. She looked just like the woman he loved, warm, affectionate, familiar. Was I imagining things? He asked himself. The bits of conversation he'd heard were definitely strange, but maybe he'd misunderstood. The acoustics in the bathroom could have warped her words. Maybe the parts he caught weren't what they sounded like. She would never lie to him, would she? "You okay?" Laura asked, watching him with a curious tilt of her head as she slipped beneath the covers. James realized he was still standing there, sockless, dazed. He gave a slight shake of his head and forced a smile. "Yeah, just wiped from work." He crawled into bed beside her. She nestled against him, already half asleep. He turned off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. But sleep didn't come easily. In the silence, her words echoed again in his mind. "He doesn't know a thing. Same time, same place. I miss you." And the way she had stopped herself from finishing, "I love you." He tried to dismiss it. "She loves me." She wouldn't do that. Then a face flashed through his mind. Derek, his best friend, practically a brother. If something was wrong, Derek would notice. Wouldn't he? But Derek had seemed his usual self the last time they spoke. No signs of anything strange. Still, James couldn't shake the knot forming in his chest. As Laura slept peacefully at his side, James lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling. It was just one night, just a few words. It shouldn't mean anything. But it did. And as his thoughts spiraled, one troubling notion refused to let go. What if the life I thought was perfect isn't? Chapter 2, The Unveiling. The next morning, James awoke with a heavy heart and a stomach in knots. Rest had been shallow and broken. Laura's whispered conversation played on loop in his mind, each word etched sharper than the last. Over breakfast, he watched her carefully, his eyes following her as she hummed softly while packing lunches for the kids. Everything about her seemed as it always did, loving, efficient, in control. She kissed him on the cheek as she handed him a travel mug, gave a cheerful reminder about Sophie's soccer practice, and chatted as though nothing had changed. For a moment, James felt ridiculous. Maybe it really was nothing. Maybe he had completely misunderstood what he'd heard. But when Laura herded the kids into the SUV and drove off toward school, that hollow feeling returned. The lie she'd told about speaking with her sister, it lingered like a splinter under the skin. Once the house fell into quiet again, James pulled out his phone and made a call. Casual, friendly, nothing suspicious. He asked Melanie about the anniversary, pretending he'd forgotten the date. The conversation didn't last long. She hadn't talked to Laura at all that week. Not once. And just like that, the truth dropped like a stone in James's chest. She had lied to him. The woman who kissed him goodnight and snuggled into his side had lied straight to his face. And suddenly the house didn't feel so warm anymore. She had looked him in the eye and lied without hesitation. Now James couldn't help but wonder, who had she really been speaking to? A sick, creeping suspicion had already begun to take shape in his mind. He needed answers. Desperation sharpening into resolve, James made up his mind to dig deeper. That very afternoon, he clocked out of work early, too distracted by the gnawing questions in his head to accomplish anything productive. Laura wouldn't be home for a while. She typically ran errands or grabbed groceries after picking up the kids, and Sophie had soccer that day. That gave James a window, a couple of uninterrupted hours. He settled at the desk in their home office and reached for Laura's laptop, which was resting on the charger. It immediately asked for a password. He gave a few obvious ones a try: her birthday, their daughter's name, even a sarcastic attempt with password 123. None unlocked it. Biting his lip, James realized she must have set something less predictable. He picked up the desk phone next, the old landline they barely used except for the occasional work call. Flipping through the caller ID history, nothing stood out. Then he turned to their cell phone provider's website and logged into the billing records tied to Laura's number. Scrolling through call logs and text history, one particular number popped up again and again. It kept appearing late at night and during work hours, times when James knew he wasn't home. His heart sank when he saw who it belonged to: Derek. There were dozens, no hundreds of messages and calls between Laura and Derek stretching back months. Sometimes they spoke several times in a single day. Many of those calls were at strange hours, late nights, early mornings, even mid-afternoons when James was at the office. Heat surged up James's neck. The cold, undeniable pattern of secret communication between his wife and his closest friend rattled him to his core. He tried to stay calm, telling himself there might be a reasonable explanation. After all, Derek was his friend, more than that, practically family. They'd been close since their college days. Laura and Derek had always gotten along. He'd joined them for barbecues, helped plan surprise gifts, even hung out on quiet weekends if he was in town. Derek's job kept him traveling a lot. He was a regional sales manager, but they still stayed in touch. He had once worked with Laura to organize a surprise birthday for James. But this many calls, and all of it hidden from him? James's gut told him something was deeply wrong. His hands shook as he closed the phone bill. Maybe her phone held more answers. Laura tended to keep it with her, but there were moments, like when she cooked dinner, when it sat charging unattended in the kitchen. If he could get into it, maybe he'd find the truth. He racked his brain for what her phone passcode might be. She'd sometimes used the kids' birthdays for codes in the past. Before he could think further, the sound of the garage door suddenly rumbled through the house. James's stomach dropped. She was back, sooner than he'd expected. Maybe she'd dropped Sophie at practice first and skipped the grocery run. He slammed the laptop shut and exited the office, forcing himself to act normal. Laura entered carrying grocery bags. "Oh, I didn't know you were home already," she said, sounding genuinely surprised. "Yeah, work was slow today," James replied, smiling tightly as he grabbed one of the bags to help. "Thought I'd get a head start on the weekend." "That's nice," Laura said, leaning over to kiss his cheek. For just a moment, something flickered in her expression. Nerves? But she quickly returned to chatting, unpacking groceries, and bringing up an upcoming school event. James nodded, pretending to listen, though all he could think about was that log of calls between her and Derek. Over the next few days, James kept up the act while secretly watching her every move. His own home felt foreign to him, each conversation filtered through suspicion. The worst moments came at night, lying beside Laura in bed. He couldn't shake the image of her messaging Derek under the covers, or sneaking out once he'd fallen asleep to call him. The hurt festered, growing sharper with each passing hour. But he couldn't accuse her without irrefutable proof. Phone records weren't enough. He needed to see it, really see it, with his own eyes. Even if it broke him. That chance arrived on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Derek had phoned earlier that morning to say he'd be heading out of town for a week on business. James immediately remembered overhearing Laura the day before, murmuring into her phone, "Tomorrow, same place as always." Tomorrow. If Derek was her secret partner, and he was leaving town, they might plan to meet one last time before his trip. The thought turned James's stomach. But then it hit him. If the meeting was tomorrow, there had to be messages about it today. Laura was tending to her garden in the backyard, her hands buried in soil as Liam swung back and forth on the playset. Sophie wasn't home. She was spending the afternoon at a friend's. Inside, Laura's phone sat on the kitchen counter, charging. James noticed it, unattended and alone. His heart pounded as he approached. He unplugged the charger and tapped the screen. A lock screen greeted him. He hesitated, then entered a code he recalled from years ago. Laura's old luggage combination, her birth date, 0721. The screen unlocked. Relief nearly knocked the air out of him. With trembling hands, he started scrolling through her messages. Most were harmless exchanges, chats with relatives, check-ins with friends, until one conversation caught his eye. It was with someone named Derek. The thread was muted. The bell icon next to it had a line through it, signaling that notifications had been silenced. James tapped it. His pulse surged so violently he could hear it in his ears. The conversation hadn't been deleted. Fresh messages from that very morning appeared at the bottom. Derek: "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Same spot at 1? Laura: "Yes. I'll tell James I have a meeting with a client. I need you." Laura again: "Last week was incredible. I keep thinking about it." Derek: "Same here. Love you." Laura: "Love you too." James's hands shook uncontrollably. He nearly fumbled the phone. He kept scrolling, needing to see more. Weeks' worth of conversations unfurled. Messages filled with flirtation, confessions of nights spent together while James was away for work, and cheeky jokes about sneaking kisses at a neighborhood BBQ while James had been mere feet away, manning the grill. Then came the photos. The images loaded slowly like punches winding up. Laura in lingerie blowing a kiss at the camera. Derek reclining shirtless in what appeared to be a hotel bed, smiling lazily. And then one photo that stole the breath from James's lungs. Laura and Derek together, wrapped in sheets, limbs tangled. Her bare shoulders peeked out from under the covers. Derek's arm was draped around her like it belonged there. The timestamp hit like a hammer, 2 months ago. That same weekend, James had taken the kids camping. Laura had stayed behind, saying she needed peace and quiet to work on a design deadline. James's chest clamped shut. His stomach turned. He staggered to the sink just in time to vomit. He clutched the counter with one hand, the other pressed to his mouth as the tears came, hot, angry, and bitter. Each message was a blow, each picture a fresh cut. His wife and his best friend. The betrayal wasn't a possibility anymore, it was a fact. His world hadn't just cracked, it had shattered. The woman he loved. The man he trusted. Together. Behind his back. He powered off the phone, thoughts racing. Part of him wanted to confront her now, demand the truth, let the fury out. But another part of him was drowning in sorrow. He needed evidence. He had to be sure nothing could be denied, twisted, or erased. With hands still unsteady, James forwarded the damning texts and photos to his personal email. He also used his own phone to snap pictures of the screen, just to be safe. Proof. That's what he needed now. It made him sick to think this way, about his own wife, about Derek, but he had no choice. This was real. Then the patio door slid open behind him. Laura's voice floated in from outside. "James, can you give me a hand with something out here?" His heart jumped. Quickly, he placed her phone back where it had been, lining it up exactly. He wiped his mouth on the back of his hand and splashed cold water on his face, erasing the tears. He glanced up at the window and caught his reflection, haunted, hollow-eyed. But beneath the heartbreak, something else was forming. A hard edge, a resolve. "I'll be right there," he called, surprised by how calm he sounded. Then he stepped outside, one foot in front of the other, carrying the weight of everything he had just learned. Laura knelt in the garden, nestled among her rose bushes, a trowel poised in her hand. She looked perfectly at peace, as though her world had not been turned upside down. When she lifted her eyes and met James's gaze, she offered a smile so warm it made his insides churn. How could she look at him like that, so effortlessly kind, after what she had done? A storm brewed within him, screaming to erupt. He wanted to demand answers. How long had she been lying to him? Had their years together ever meant anything, or had they all been built on falsehoods? But he bit back the questions, knowing it wasn't the time. Liam was nearby, running around the yard without a care, still shielded from the emotional wreckage looming over his parents. James smothered his rage, knelt beside Laura, and tugged at a weed that clung stubbornly to the soil. He nodded at her words, idle talk about redoing the flower beds, though none of them registered. His heart was unraveling silently, shredded under the weight of what he now knew. That evening, James could hardly bring himself to look at her. During dinner, he barely touched his meal, absently pushing food from one side of the plate to the other. Laura barely noticed. Her attention seemed locked on her phone. James imagined with bitterness that she was messaging Derek, setting up their next secret meeting. She looked at him now and then, her glances cautious. Maybe she sensed something had shifted in him. He kept his expression neutral, though the silence between them carried its own accusations. When the meal ended, he excused himself, mumbling something about a headache, and left Laura to handle bedtime on her own. Upstairs in his office, James paced like a caged animal, emotions swinging violently from grief to fury. Images of their shared memories flooded his mind, once cherished moments now forever tainted. Then, just as quickly, his sorrow would twist into rage, fists clenching at the thought of Derek, someone he'd trusted like family, betraying him in the most personal way imaginable. His thoughts spiraled. Should he go straight to Derek and demand an explanation or retribution? The temptation to confront him physically surged, but Derek had the convenient excuse of being out of town, and the real reckoning needed to be with Laura. Later that night, when Laura finally slipped into bed, James feigned sleep. He couldn't face her, not yet, not with the truth burning in his chest. He felt the bed shift beneath her weight, listened to the quiet sigh she released, and after some time, her breathing slowed into the rhythm of sleep. Meanwhile, James lay stiff and still, eyes wide open in the dark. His thoughts spinning while the woman beside him rested peacefully, as if their world hadn't shattered just hours before. That surreal feeling returned. He had discovered something unspeakable, yet here they were, side by side, with only inches of space between them and an emotional chasm that felt infinite. The next morning, James knew he couldn't pretend any longer. The secret he carried gnawed at him with every breath. After dropping off the kids, Laura claimed she had a morning appointment with a client, though James strongly suspected it was another secret rendezvous with Derek. When he came back home unexpectedly, he found Laura in the kitchen, buttoning her jacket, polished and ready to leave. "You're back already. Everything all right?" she asked, her voice laced with surprise. James closed the door quietly behind him. A strange calm had overtaken him, his fury now cold and sharp. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady. Laura hesitated, reaching for her keys. "Can this wait?" "I'm running late for a client meeting," she replied, avoiding his eyes. "A client meeting? Sure," he said, his words tight and clipped. "Let's stop pretending. I know everything." Her hand froze mid-reach. She turned to him slowly, her face composed but her voice brittle. "Know what?" she asked, too lightly, but the tension in her tone gave her away. James stepped forward and placed his phone on the counter. On the screen was a photo, clear, undeniable, of Laura and Derek locked in an intimate embrace. Laura's face went pale. Her eyes widened in horror as the color drained from her cheeks. For a few agonizing seconds, neither of them said a word. Laura's gaze flicked from the image to James, her mouth parting as though to speak, but no words came. The kitchen clock ticked on, indifferent and steady, counting time in a moment that had just broken everything. At last, James spoke, his voice barely more than a tremble. "Why, Laura? How could you do this to me, to everything we've built?" His attempt to stay composed fell apart as he continued, his words thick with heartache. "Derek? My closest friend? How long has this been going on behind my back?" Laura's lips parted, but no sound emerged. She looked as though she might collapse from nausea. "James, she began, her voice fragile. Tears sprang into her eyes, sudden and unbidden. "I can explain." "Explain?" he repeated coldly, fury rising like a tide. "Explain how you've been sneaking around with him, lying to my face every single day? Pretending this was real? Pretending you still loved me?" He thrust a finger toward the phone on the counter. The screen still showed the image that had shattered everything. "Well, I'm listening, Laura. Go on." His tone made her recoil. A tear slid down her cheek. "It just happened," she murmured. "I never wanted to hurt you." James let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Never wanted to hurt me?" he shot back. "You've wrecked me, Laura." His voice climbed, filling the kitchen like a storm breaking loose. "I trusted you. I trusted him." He took a breath that caught in his throat. "What about the kids? What about Sophie and Liam? Do you even realize what you've done to them?" "Lower your voice," Laura hissed, her eyes darting toward the hallway, as if afraid the children might hear, even in their absence. Her cheeks had turned crimson, a flicker of defensiveness flashing through her grief-stricken face. "The neighbors—" "The neighbors?" James cut her off, his expression incredulous. "That's what matters to you now?" "What people will think." He shook his head slowly, his gaze hollow. "Who even are you?" "Because the woman standing here, she's a stranger to me." Laura wiped her face, her posture stiffening with something close to anger. "You're not completely innocent either," she snapped, taking him by surprise. "Yes, I made a mistake. I know that—" "Mistake?" he echoed, his voice thick with sarcasm. "That's what you're calling this? How long, Laura? How long have you been betraying me?" She hesitated. Then, almost as if against her will, she admitted, "Almost a year." James reeled, as if the words themselves had struck him. A year. 12 months of lies and betrayal. Laura rushed to fill the silence. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I was lonely. Derek was just there. You were always away, at work, on business, and I was here trying to keep everything together. I felt invisible." The words poured from her, raw and urgent. Explanations James had only ever seen fictional cheaters give on TV, never imagining he'd hear them from his own wife. "So this is my fault now?" he asked, stunned. His fists clenched at his sides, barely restrained. "I was killing myself to support this family, to build a life for us. And that meant nothing to you?" "That's not fair," she fired back, voice sharp. "It's not that it meant nothing." "But you were gone more than you were here. We stopped talking. I stopped feeling seen." "And Derek?" he asked, his voice flat. "He listened," she whispered. "He made me feel like I mattered again." I didn't plan for it to turn into anything serious. But even she seemed to recognize how hollow her justification sounded. James stared at her in silence, the taste of betrayal like ash on his tongue. He thought of the nights he'd stayed at the office, burning through deadlines, telling himself Laura had his back, that she believed in what they were building. And now, he realized, she hadn't been waiting for him at all. There were times when he came home completely drained. Maybe he'd seemed distant during those evenings, but nothing he did could ever justify this. "So being lonely meant you had to sleep with my best friend?" he asked quietly, the words bitter in his mouth. "That's your excuse, Laura? That's garbage, and you know it." He swallowed hard, voice tightening with restraint. "You could have come to me, suggested therapy, yelled, anything." His voice faltered as the weight of it all pressed down. "But cheating? Hiding it from me with Derek? He turned away, struggling to hold himself together as another surge of anguish threatened to unravel him. He refused to break in front of her. He wouldn't let her see the devastation she'd caused. Laura's eyes flashed, caught between guilt and annoyance. She must have realized that sorry wasn't going to cut it anymore. So she changed approach. "What now, James?" she asked, her tone suddenly cold and measured. "There's no undoing this. If you want a divorce, fine." She squared her shoulders, and in that moment, he saw a new hardness in her, a kind of quiet rebellion. "Maybe it's for the best," she added. The word hung like smoke in the air. Divorce. Hearing her say it made James's stomach twist. He'd imagined something more raw if this moment ever came, shouting, maybe sobbing, desperate apologies. But not this emotionless admission. There was no plea for forgiveness in her voice, no intention to cut ties with Derek or fight for their marriage. Instead, she sounded ready to walk away, almost eager. Did she even regret what she'd done? Or had she already detached from the life they built together? "So this is really happening," James said, his voice hollow. It wasn't a question anymore. The reality hit him hard. She wanted to leave. She chose Derek. All the deception, all the lies. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a plan. She was willing to throw away everything they had without a second thought. Laura straightened, brushing her jacket with trembling fingers. "You're never going to forgive me," she said softly. "And I can't keep living like this and buried in guilt." She paused before continuing, this time with a sharper edge to her words. "Maybe it's better if we both move forward. And don't think I'm going to let you drag this out or make it messy. I'm filing for divorce and I'll be getting what's fair." A chill ran through James, cutting through his rage. "Fair?" he echoed, stunned. "You think you deserve something after everything you've done?" His voice cracked with disbelief. "You're the one who destroyed this family, Laura." Her expression hardened. "I gave up years of my life for us. For you. I put my career on pause to raise Sophie and Liam. Don't you dare pretend I'm not owed anything." She spoke with rehearsed clarity now, her words sharp and practiced. "I'll be going after the house. Full custody of the kids. Alimony. My attorney will be reaching out." The calculation in her tone chilled him. It hit James then. Maybe she and Derek had already discussed all of this. Derek had always been clever, strategic. If he convinced Laura to leave, he'd make sure she took as much with her as possible. A fresh wave of betrayal slammed into James, and he had to grip the counter just to remain upright. The woman standing before him was a stranger. The loving partner he once knew had vanished. What was left was someone armored in bitterness and strategy. Whether it came from shame or the lure of a new life with Derek, she was prepared to go to war. The realization settled heavily in his chest. It was over. Their marriage, their history, obliterated. The woman he loved was gone, and the one who stood in her place seemed determined to tear down whatever was left. Their children, their home. Everything he valued was now at risk. Laura reached for her keys, her hand visibly trembling. "I'm staying at a hotel tonight," she said softly. "I'll come back for my things later." There was something in her eyes just before she turned. Regret, maybe, or fear. But it passed quickly, like a shadow. She didn't allow herself to hesitate. "This is the right thing, James," she told herself silently. "For both of us." Without another word, she pivoted and stepped out the front door, leaving James frozen in the kitchen, rooted in place by shock. His phone screen had dimmed to black by now, but the image burned into his mind didn't need refreshing. The truth it had shown was unforgettable. The silence in the house was suffocating. The children were still at school, blissfully unaware that their lives were on the verge of unraveling. James slowly collapsed into a chair, his entire body trembling. In mere moments, everything he thought was solid had come undone. He stared ahead unseeing, at the breakfast table still cluttered from the morning. 2 coffee mugs sat abandoned, his and Laura's, from just hours earlier, when they had looked like any other married couple. A strangled sob slipped from his throat as he buried his face in his hands. Never before had he felt such a sharp mix of anguish, fury, and confusion. Only yesterday he'd considered himself the luckiest man on earth. Now that comforting illusion had been obliterated, replaced by a waking nightmare. His wife was leaving him, for his closest friend. And she wasn't stopping there. She planned to take the house, the children, and whatever was left of his pride. As the grandfather clock in the living room marked the hour with its mechanical chime, James felt a cold, creeping certainty. This was only the start of a much darker chapter. Laura would find a lawyer. The fight ahead promised to be ruthless. And through the haze of grief and disbelief, one thing stood out like a beacon of truth. Nothing would ever be the same again. Her betrayal hadn't just broken his heart. It had demolished the entire life he had built. Chapter 3. Breaking point. Just as she said she would, Laura filed for divorce within the week. The days that followed blurred into one long stretch of heartache for James. She had taken Sophie and Liam to stay with her sister. He learned this through a curt, impersonal text the day she left. The house was still and hollow, the silence almost mocking. Without the laughter of his children, it no longer felt like a home. He drifted through each room like a ghost, chased by the ghosts of better times. Sophie's colorful artwork still clung to the refrigerator door. Liam's toys remained scattered across the living room floor, untouched since the last time he played there. Reminders of the life that had, until recently, seemed so warm and complete, now left in ruins. One evening, James finally summoned the strength to call. It had been 3 long days since he'd seen his children. The ache in his chest was unbearable. Sophie answered. "Hey, sweetheart," James said gently, his voice barely holding steady. "Hi." Her reply was soft, unsure. In the background, he could just make out the noise of the television and Liam's distant chatter. "How are you two holding up?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. "I miss you both more than anything." "We're okay," Sophie replied after a moment. Then a pause. "We're at Aunt Melanie's. Mom said we'll be here for a while." James swallowed hard. "I know. That's all right. I just want you to remember something, okay? None of this, what's happening between your mom and me, is your fault. Not even a little bit. We both love you and Liam so much." Sophie didn't reply right away. When she did, her voice wavered slightly. "Mom said you and her had a big fight, and that you didn't want to live with us anymore." The words were quiet and hesitant, but they landed like a blow to his chest. "What?" James gasped. "No, honey, that's not true. I would never ... He heard a shuffle on the line, and suddenly Laura's voice cut in, sharp and cold. "Now's not the time, James. The kids are still trying to understand everything. Don't confuse them." "Laura, I just don't want them thinking I abandoned them," he said, his voice rising with desperation. Her tone remained frosty. "You gave us no choice when you exploded the way you did. They don't need to hear the details. Just back off. Let them adjust. We can talk about a visit later." Then silence. The call ended. James stared at the phone in his hand, numb, as if someone had struck him. "She's turning them against me," he realized in horror. The conversation left him shaking, sick with dread. That night, he found himself curled up on the living room couch, gripping a worn photograph of his family as though it could anchor him to what was slipping away. His tears disappeared into the shadows, and with every quiet sob, he questioned how the woman he once adored had become a stranger. The divorce proceedings spiraled fast and mercilessly. Within days, Laura's lawyer delivered official documents, citing irreconcilable differences as the reason for separation. Along with the papers came a provisional arrangement. Laura would remain in the family residence with the children, and James was to leave the premises immediately in order to prevent further strain. Though the wording suggested cooperation, James could see the careful orchestration behind it. It was clearly crafted by Laura's legal team. She returned to the house not alone, but with a legal notice in hand and a uniformed police officer by her side, ensuring that the handover went smoothly while James gathered a few of his belongings. It was surreal. Standing there in what had once been his home, only to watch an officer patrol the space like James himself was a threat to peace. The humiliation was overwhelming. "Daddy, where are you going?" came Liam's soft voice as James rushed to pack a suitcase. The children had been brought back home under supervision, supposedly to maintain a sense of stability, while Laura resumed her role as the resident parent. Liam's wide, anxious eyes searched James's face for comfort. James dropped to his knees and hugged his son tightly, doing his best to keep his voice calm despite the raw ache in his throat. "I'm going to stay somewhere else for a bit, okay, buddy?" he said gently. "But I'll be back to see you really soon. I promise. I love you so, so much." Liam held on tightly, his tiny arms trembling. "Love you, Dad," he whispered, voice shaking. Just behind him, Sophie stood with her arms folded across her chest, trying to contain the flood of emotions that shimmered in her teary eyes. She bit down on her lip, unwilling to let herself cry in front of them all. James extended a hand toward her. "Sophie, sweetheart." She hesitated for a second, then stepped forward and allowed herself to fall into his embrace. He felt the tremble in her shoulders as she whispered into his shirt. "I'm sorry." Those two words wrecked him. She believed she had something to apologize for. "No, Soph." "No," James said, his voice catching as he gently ran his hand through her hair. "This isn't your fault. Not one bit. I'm the one who's sorry. I hate that this is happening. I love you and your brother more than anything in this world." He kissed the crown of her head, aching for time to stop, just so he could hold them both a little longer. "That's enough now," Laura's voice cut in from the doorway. Her tone was sharp, almost uneasy. Maybe it was the way the kids clung to him that didn't fit the story she was trying to tell. Sophie quickly wiped her cheeks and backed away, returning to her mother's side with robotic obedience. James looked at Laura, silently pleading. "We'll figure out visitation later," she said coolly, refusing to meet his eyes. "Let's go, kids." And with that, James was walked out of his own house. All he could take with him were a few suitcases filled with clothes and necessities. That was it. As he pulled out of the driveway, the last thing he saw was his son and daughter standing in the entryway. Laura's hands rested on their shoulders. Liam cried openly, his small body shaking. Sophie turned her face into Laura's sleeve, shoulders trembling with silent sobs. James forced himself to keep driving, his vision blurred with tears, the neighborhood dissolving behind him as though it were part of a life he could never return to. His chest felt torn open. He settled into a modest, furnished apartment on the other side of town, the only place available on such short notice and within the limits of what he could afford, especially with the coming legal expenses and the support payments he knew would be demanded. The place felt cold and foreign. Beige walls, a worn couch, and two tiny bedrooms, one of which he instinctively planned to set up for the kids, despite not knowing when he'd see them again. That first night he lay on the couch, eyes fixed on the ceiling until morning crept in, the silence around him so loud it hurt. The days that followed were some of the darkest James had ever known. He hired a divorce attorney, a kind, steady man named Richard, who didn't sugarcoat the road ahead. "She's seeking full custody, substantial child support, and alimony," Richard said during one of their early meetings, his expression somber. The words hit like stones. "They're painting a picture of you as a neglectful father," Richard began, his tone cautious, "and suggesting that you have a temper that makes the household feel unsafe." "Unstable," James echoed, his thoughts spinning. "Anger issues?" I would never harm my children," he protested, his voice tight with disbelief. Richard raised a calming hand. "I believe you. This is legal strategy. They're highlighting one particular incident where you apparently lost your temper. No claims of violence, just that you shouted and it emotionally impacted the kids. They're framing it as proof you can't provide a secure home." He continued. "Given that Laura's been the kids' main caregiver, the court will likely prioritize keeping their routine consistent, for now at least." James's stomach churned. The realization hit him hard. That argument with Laura and the fact she had forced him out afterward, it all fit too neatly into this version of events. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "She's the one who betrayed our family, and yet I'm the one being cast as the bad guy?" Richard let out a weary sigh. "Unfortunately, family court doesn't deal in moral justice. The focus is solely on what serves the children's best interest. Unless her affair directly endangered them, the judge won't factor it in. What matters is who's been taking care of them day to day and where they're likely to feel most secure." He paused. Remind me how old your kids are again. Sophie's 12. Liam's 8, James answered, already anticipating where this was headed. They're old enough, especially Sophie, for their preferences to be taken seriously by the court, Richard said gently. If they say they want to live mostly with their mom, the judge will listen. James felt his shoulders sag. If Laura had already influenced their opinions, they might choose to stay with her. Not out of fairness, but because they'd been swayed. The thought that his own children might believe he'd abandoned them, or worse, that he was the reason their lives were upended, was a kind of agony James couldn't put into words. As the legal process dragged on, James functioned on autopilot, submerged in a fog of sorrow. He managed to keep his job, but just barely. His performance faltered, and his frequent absences for court appearances and lawyer meetings didn't go unnoticed by his boss. People around him saw the toll. His face grew gaunt, his eyes sunken. Co-workers and friends occasionally tried to reach out, offer comfort, or suggest meeting for drinks, but James almost always declined. He shut down, withdrawing from nearly everyone. How could he even begin to explain that his world had crumbled? Word of the divorce spread quickly through their social circle. Whispers circulated, some accurate, others cruelly distorted. Rumors hinted at infidelity, at Laura leaving him for another man. But James, ashamed and wrecked, lacked the energy to correct any of it or to confide in someone who might actually listen. When he did see his kids, the visits felt like emotional minefields. One time they met at a local park. Laura sat rigidly on a bench nearby, arms folded, her watchful eyes never leaving them. Sophie, though polite, seemed distant, torn between loyalty and uncertainty. Liam, by contrast, clung to James, happily rambling about school and cartoons. But as the visit ended and it came time to part, Liam burst into tears, refusing to let go of James's hand. Laura swooped in swiftly, her expression sharp with disapproval. "Say goodbye to your father," she said firmly, peeling Liam away as he sobbed his farewell. James returned to his silent apartment that night and punched the wall, scraping his knuckles before collapsing in grief. The final hearing arrived on a chilly, overcast morning, nearly half a year after Laura had filed. James sat in the courtroom, numb, barely hearing the legal arguments tossed back and forth, like he was just another case on the docket. Laura was there, calm and collected in a tailored navy dress. Beside her, in the gallery, sat Derek. It was the first time James had laid eyes on him since the day everything fell apart. Seeing Derek, once his close friend, a man he'd laughed with, trusted, now sitting beside Laura, made James's stomach twist. He gripped the table hard to keep from shaking. Derek avoided his gaze but kept a comforting hand on Laura's back. The betrayal stared James in the face, but he forced himself to focus, not on anger, but on what still mattered: Sophie and Liam. Despite Richard's best arguments, the judgment was nearly a total loss for James. The court ruled in favor of Laura having primary physical custody, citing the need for continuity and emotional security for the children. James was awarded visitation, alternate weekends and a few evening hours once a week. They would share legal custody in name, but in practice, Laura would raise the children day to day. She would stay in the family home with them until they were grown. After that, the house could be sold and the equity split. But until then, James wouldn't see any return on it. In the meantime, he was expected to continue making the mortgage payments. Because his income far exceeded Laura's, her interior design work brought in only a part-time wage, James was also ordered to pay child support and spousal maintenance. The alimony was temporary, 5 years of rehabilitative support, the judge explained, given the length of the marriage and Laura's need to re-establish full financial independence. But the monthly amount was substantial. As the judge read out the final ruling, James sat motionless, empty. The words echoed in his ears, but he felt as though he'd vanished from his own life, reduced to a shadow of the man who'd once had a family. None of James's reasoning seemed to carry any weight. Not the fact that Laura's infidelity had dismantled their marriage, not his unwavering role as a father, not even the shared parenting he'd embraced with love and commitment up until now. In the court's estimation, he had been relegated, a supporting character in his own children's lives, and a financial provider, nothing more. Laura's lawyer had crafted a compelling narrative, the devoted mother doing her best in a difficult chapter. And because James had worked grueling hours to provide a stable home for them all, it had been too easy to paint him as distant, a figure in the background, regardless of how fully present he had been when he was there. When the judge's gavel struck, finalizing what had once seemed unthinkable, something inside James fractured. It was final. 14 years of life together gone in an instant. He turned his head to see Laura embracing her attorney, relief etched into her expression. Derek stood nearby, his smile tight and triumphant. To them, this was a win. And maybe it was, at least for now, James thought with a pang of bitterness. Then his eyes found Sophie and Liam, seated in the second row beside Melanie, brought here to witness the ending. Sophie sat motionless, eyes fixed on the floor. Liam looked lost, too young to grasp the full scope, but clearly feeling the emotional weight in the room. James wanted to rise, to hold them close and reassure them. I'm still your dad. I'll never leave you. I will always fight for you. But all he managed was a glance. Sophie looked up and he gave a faint, sorrowful smile. She blinked away tears and quickly turned her face. As Melanie guided the children from the room, Laura following behind. When James exited the courthouse, the chill in the air hit like a wall. His attorney, Richard, gave a firm pat on the back, murmuring about appeals and future steps. But the words felt distant, as if spoken underwater. On the courthouse steps, Derek and Laura passed him. Derek muttered, "Sorry it ended up like this, man." His tone void of sincerity, his shrug careless. Laura didn't even acknowledge James, walking straight to Derek's car, where their children waited in the back seat. James stood frozen, watching them drive off without him. That night, he sat alone on the floor of his small, unfamiliar apartment, surrounded by a clutter of court papers, bank statements, and photos of Sophie and Liam he'd managed to bring from the house. He picked up a picture in a frame, the one of the kids at the beach, the same one that used to sit on his nightstand. Tears welled up, clouding his vision. Everything that mattered, his partner, his closest confidant, his home, his children's daily lives, had been stripped away. The stillness of the beige walls felt suffocating. For the first time, he realized he had nowhere to be tomorrow. It was Saturday, but the kids wouldn't be visiting. They were with Laura, and likely with Derek, in what used to be his home. A dark thought surfaced, sharp and quiet. What do I have left? His job? It had become hollow, just a way to fund a life he was no longer part of. His friendships? Most had drifted away, some quietly aligning themselves with Laura and Derek. Once the two of them began appearing together in public, he felt the sting of shame, remembering how soon after the divorce, he'd heard whispers of them attending neighborhood parties as a couple, as if they'd simply stepped into his life and replaced him without hesitation. It felt like he had been wiped away, replaced by someone unrecognizable. James pounded his fist against the side of the couch, his body racked by sobs he could no longer contain. Grief and rage twisted inside him, a storm devouring his every thought. He wept until there were no more tears to shed, yet the pain lingered, a crushing burden that wouldn't lift. Hours slipped by, and somehow James found himself staring into the bathroom mirror. His reflection stared back hollow-eyed and pale, every feature etched with despair. The sight unnerved him. This shell of a man didn't feel like him at all. But within that emptiness, a flicker of determination stirred. He thought of Liam's tear-streaked face, of the wary distance in Sophie's eyes. He wasn't truly abandoned. His children still needed him, even if only part of the time for now. Maybe they needed him more than ever, if he could find a way to pull himself together. He wiped his face with a scratchy paper towel and drew a shaky breath. "I'm still their dad," he rasped to his reflection. As the words left his mouth, something in his expression shifted. Less despair, a trace of strength. Laura had shattered him, left him at the lowest point of his life. But for Sophie and Liam's sake, he couldn't stay down. If he did, he risked losing them too. As the first hints of sunrise touched the apartment walls, James Miller, broken, ashamed, yet quietly defiant, made a promise to himself. "This will not be where my story ends." Chapter 4. Reclaiming Strength. The months following the divorce tested James like nothing before. Each day felt like a trial of willpower and resilience, but he refused to let the darkness win. Bit by bit, he worked to rebuild the pieces of his life still within reach. He focused on the areas he could still control. One of the first steps he took was getting physically active again. Morning jogs and basic workouts at home became a refuge, easing his mind and shedding the extra weight that had crept on during the chaos. The exertion helped more than he expected. It ignited a small but vital sense of self-worth. He joined a weekly support group for divorced parents and started therapy sessions. Sharing his own struggles and hearing others talk through theirs slowly helped him untangle the fury and sadness inside. Piece by piece, he began rebuilding the self that had been shattered. Every other weekend, like clockwork, his kids would come stay with him. At first, those weekends were fraught with tension and emotional unease. Fridays became a flurry of nervous preparation, straightening up his modest apartment, planning fun things to do. A new game for Sophie, supplies for a model rocket project with Liam. He wanted their time together to be a haven, full of laughter and consistency. Yet Sophie arrived withdrawn and silent those first few visits, barely reacting no matter how gently or enthusiastically James tried to engage her. Liam was more open, quick to offer hugs and talk, but even he would sometimes blurt out comments that pierced James straight through. Still, James never spoke ill of Laura in response. Instead, he reassured them again and again of how deeply he loved them, how precious their time together was. Over time, the tension began to fade. They started to realize that being with Dad meant peace, focus, attention. Gradually, Sophie began to thaw. One night, months in, James walked into the living room to find her curled up with one of the old Harry Potter books they used to read together. He asked gently if she wanted to read aloud like they used to, bracing for a no, but she nodded. When he sat beside her, she leaned her head against his shoulder. It was the first time since the separation she had initiated any closeness. James had to blink rapidly to keep the tears from falling as he began to read. Moments like that, small but profound, fueled his commitment to being the best parent he could be, even if only part-time. But James stayed observant too. He knew their current arrangement wasn't fair or balanced. He couldn't accept that this version of shared custody, this tilted playing field, was how things would remain, especially once he started noticing troubling patterns in his children. More and more, they arrived from Laura's home looking anxious or overtired. Sophie, once a top student, admitted in a soft voice that her grades were slipping. "It's hard to focus sometimes," she said vaguely. Liam would casually mention things that raised red flags, like how Mom and Derek went out a lot in the evenings, or that Derek could be kind of scary when he got angry. James asked gentle, non-intrusive questions, careful not to push too far. Over time, he learned more. Laura often left the children in the care of a teenage sitter or her sister Melanie, while she and Derek went on trips or attended social events. Once, Liam whispered that one night he'd woken up frightened and couldn't find either of them in the house. They had gone out for a late-night meal, careful not to disturb the sleeping children. Melanie's teenage son remained on the couch, half asleep, the only one left to keep an eye on things. As Liam recounted this, his gaze flicked between James and the floor, unsure if he was confiding something serious or just reporting what he thought was wrong. James kept his face composed, though inwardly he burned with rage and a creeping sense of dread. He pulled his son into a hug and quietly told him, "I'm glad you told me, bud. I'm always here, if anything scares you or you just need someone to talk to." From that point on, James began meticulously recording everything his children shared. He documented dates, descriptions, and events, whether minor or major. It became a habit, a quiet form of vigilance. He remembered the evening Sophie casually mentioned she had to prepare dinner for herself and Liam because their mom had been tied up with calls. James strongly suspected that calls was Laura's way of masking dates or social meetups. There was the soccer match she missed, the one where Liam had scanned the crowd repeatedly, searching in vain for her face. There was the day he picked up the kids and noticed Sophie wearing shoes clearly 2 sizes too small, an obvious sign she hadn't been taken shopping in a long while. Each account, each observation, added another piece to the bigger picture James was assembling. It painted a story of a mother whose focus had shifted from parenting to pursuing her own pleasures. Even though James was already contributing a generous amount in child support, he found himself frequently filling in the gaps, buying clothes, school materials, and other basics. He didn't mind doing it for his kids, but it forced the question to surface again and again. Where was all the money going? That question found its answer whenever he saw Laura in town. She was frequently adorned with expensive new accessories, handbags, jewelry, and drove a gleaming SUV one Derek had supposedly helped her acquire. Neighbors occasionally mentioned the extravagant parties thrown at what used to be his house, where wine flowed and luxury abounded. It made James sick to think of his children living amid such glaringly skewed priorities. Eventually, after hearing one too many stories of them being left with sitters or dismissed entirely, James decided it was time to act more decisively. He brought in a private investigator, a discreet, seasoned man named Carl, known for his thorough and quiet professionalism. At first, James wrestled with guilt. It felt low to surveil the mother of his children. But he reminded himself, this wasn't about revenge, it was about Liam and Sophie. They deserved better than being afterthoughts in their own home. Given how skillfully Laura had once twisted the legal system in her favor, James knew that only undeniable evidence would make a difference now. Carl got to work, shadowing Laura and Derek over the span of several months. The findings were often hard to stomach. He produced images of Laura leading the kids through upscale shopping centers, only to disregard them while indulging in hours of personal retail therapy. He tracked nights where Laura left Liam and Sophie under Derek's supervision so she could visit spas or attend social gatherings. Sophie later revealed that on those nights, dinner often meant cereal because Derek would disappear into James's old home office and shut the door for hours, completely neglecting them. One Saturday stood out. Carl had tailed them to a downtown brunch where Laura and Derek erupted into a public argument. The photos showed Laura, visibly furious, pointing and shouting at Derek. The pair left the restaurant in separate directions, abandoning the kids at the table. It took nearly 30 minutes before Laura returned to gather them. That same evening, when James picked them up as part of his scheduled custody, Sophie was unusually silent. Now, James finally understood the reason behind her withdrawn demeanor. Alongside Carl's surveillance of Laura's negligence, James quietly began looking into Derek's business affairs. Through Carl's network and some quiet whispers in the industry, James uncovered disturbing truths. Derek had been engaging in shady practices, bribing clients, manipulating sales records, even embezzling funds. One of Derek's major clients had recently cut ties with him quietly, amid murmurs of fraud and unethical dealings. Carl managed to secure copies of financial documents and emails indicating that Derek had been siphoning money from his company's accounts. Much of it, James noted with bitter amusement, had likely funded the luxury items Laura flaunted around town. Over nearly 2 years, James compiled a comprehensive case. He stored everything securely, a password-protected digital archive and a locked binder that steadily grew thicker with photographs, receipts, emails, reports, and handwritten notes. Every time he felt anger threatening to overtake him, he poured that energy into organization and patience. He was in this for the long haul, and he knew that the long game required discipline. While all of this was unfolding, James's personal and professional life quietly began to flourish. Despite the emotional chaos, he maintained focus at work. His diligence didn't go unnoticed. Eventually, his boss trusted him with larger accounts, and he was promoted to team lead. The accompanying raise helped offset the ongoing costs of child support and the investigator. But more importantly, it marked a turning point. While chaos churned in the background, James was quietly building not just a case, but a better life. After a year, James had managed to upgrade from his cramped apartment to a modestly larger townhome. It wasn't extravagant, but it had an extra bedroom, enough space for both Sophie and Liam to have their own rooms when they stayed with him. He took a weekend when the kids were with him to repaint those rooms in the colors they each loved most: sky blue for Liam, lavender for Sophie. He let them help with the painting, turning the task into a family project. They laughed together as paint ended up on clothes and faces, more on them than the walls. That night, Sophie told him it had been the most fun she'd had in ages. Moments like that reminded James he was making progress. 2 years after the divorce, James hardly resembled the man he once was. His appearance had taken a turn for the better. He looked years younger, fitter, more energized. He had even trained for and completed a half-marathon, crossing the finish line with a victorious fist raised high. Emotionally, therapy had helped him transform his grief. What once felt like raw, unpredictable pain had become a quiet, steady determination. He hadn't entered into any serious relationships since the split. Though some friends had tried to introduce him to new people, James always gently declined. He was focused on his healing and on his kids. The idea of opening his heart again felt overwhelming, but he held on to the hope that someday he'd be ready. As time wore on, an unexpected shift occurred. Sophie and Liam began to notice the inconsistencies in their mother's behavior. Sophie, especially, now nearly 15, was growing more perceptive. During their weekends together, she'd sometimes open up to James, sharing frustrations she kept buried at home. "Mom's barely around anymore," she muttered one evening, helping him dice vegetables for dinner. "She says she's working or with Derek, but it's like we're not really that important to her." James fought the instinct to say something vindicating. He took no comfort in his daughter's hurt, even though it echoed what he had feared all along. Instead, he stayed quiet for a moment before gently responding, "I'm sorry you feel that way. You and Liam should always come first." Sophie gave a small, tired smile, grateful for being heard. Liam, ever sweet and full of trust, still loved both parents deeply. But even he occasionally asked questions that hinted at confusion. "Dad, how come you're always at my games now, but Mom usually can't come?" James would hug him and reply softly, "Both of us love you, buddy." Life just gets busy sometimes. But privately, the pattern only strengthened James's sense that things needed to change, and now he was ready to take that step. Late one night, James sat beneath the glow of his desk lamp, flipping through a binder filled with carefully organized documentation. He had compiled detailed timelines, photos of questionable incidents, bank records that hinted at financial irresponsibility, and sworn statements from others. One affidavit came from a neighbor who had witnessed the kids alone and in distress late one evening. Another was from Liam's soccer coach, who noted how seldom Laura showed up to games or major events. It was time to move forward. The following week, James met with a new attorney he'd thoroughly vetted, an experienced family law expert, well regarded for handling custody revisions after divorce. As he laid the documents before her, she leafed through the materials with growing surprise. "This is pretty damning," she said quietly, pausing at a photo of Laura stumbling drunkenly from a bar on a night she had claimed the kids were sleeping at a friend's. James nodded. Carl had done his job well, capturing the kind of moments that couldn't be ignored. "I want to do this right," James said firmly. "I've spent 2 years rebuilding my life, creating stability for my kids. And their mother." He gestured at the evidence spread across her desk. "They're not getting what they deserve from her." The lawyer met his gaze. "I agree," she said. "We'll file a motion to modify custody, arguing a substantial change in circumstances and providing proof of neglect. From what I've seen, there's more than enough here to bring it before a judge." James exhaled deeply, a cocktail of nerves and hope rising in his chest. This was the moment everything could begin to change, the culmination of every calculated step he'd taken. This was the moment he had envisioned through countless sleepless nights. He was under no illusion that the road ahead would be smooth. Laura, fiercely territorial, would claw at whatever power remained in her grasp. But James wasn't the defeated shell of a man she'd once trampled. He had rebuilt himself, wiser, steadier, and unwilling to yield, especially when it came to his children or his self-worth. As he stepped out of the law office that afternoon, the sunlight touched his skin with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Closing his eyes, he drew in a deep breath. This time, he promised himself, "I won't back down. I will make this right." Chapter 5. Tactical Shifts. More than 2 years had crawled by since James had walked out of a courtroom with his heart in pieces. Now he was walking back into one, but under very different circumstances. The anxiety was still there, coiled tightly in his chest. But this time he wasn't defending himself. He was ready to challenge. The hearing to reconsider custody had been scheduled for a crisp, clear spring morning. James arrived early, flanked by his attorney, who carried the thick binder of documentation they had assembled piece by piece. Settling into the petitioner's seat, James adjusted his tie, hands slightly trembling. He cast a glance over his shoulder. A handful of people filled the benches, friends who had shown up just to lend their presence. Then the doors opened again. Laura entered with her usual confidence, Derek shadowing her protectively, her attorney on the opposite side. She was immaculately dressed, as always, but there were signs of fatigue around her eyes, lines of unease that hadn't been there the last time they faced each other in court. She deliberately avoided James's eyes as they took their places. Derek sat behind her, arms folded, face set in irritation, as though the entire ordeal was beneath them. As soon as the judge gave the go-ahead, James's lawyer began laying out their case with measured authority. She informed the court they were seeking a custody change, citing serious developments and worries about the current living conditions of the children. Laura's attorney fired back, claiming it was nothing more than an embittered ex, attempting to revisit an old dispute. But the courtroom shifted when the evidence started flowing. A youth soccer coach took the stand, recounting how James never missed a single game, while Laura was absent more often than not. One incident stuck out. Liam had been left waiting nearly an hour after practice, alone until Laura showed up late, having been held up by a spa appointment. The judge's expression grew visibly concerned. Next came financial documents. James's lawyer methodically went through bank statements and receipts, showing that despite receiving generous support payments, Laura had prioritized her own indulgences, high-end fashion, luxury gadgets, spa treatments, while neglecting critical expenses for the children. Tuition fees, school supplies, and even basic clothing were often unpaid, and James had frequently stepped in to cover the shortfall. Laura squirmed slightly as the details were made public. Her attorney objected, insisting her personal spending habits were irrelevant, but the judge disagreed. The misallocation of child support funds, she noted, was directly related to parental responsibility. Then came the visuals, the surveillance reports and photos. James' legal team presented time-stamped evidence. Laura stumbling home late at night, visibly intoxicated. On an evening when the children had been left with a neighbor, images of her and Derek lounging at a resort. During a period she had claimed she was too unwell to take the children. A heartbreaking photo of the kids staring out the window after nightfall, alone, waiting. That same night, Laura and Derek had attended a high-profile gala, leaving their children in the care of a tired teenage babysitter. Each piece of evidence struck like a blow. The judge's brow furrowed deeper with each passing minute. At one point she paused, lifted her gaze, and asked pointedly, "And where were the parents on this particular evening?" The reply hung in the air, heavy and damning. "At a charity gala, Your Honor, while the children were home alone." A child welfare advocate assigned to the case took the stand next. She reported that Sophie expressed love for both parents, but admitted she felt her mother wasn't present when it mattered most. She described feeling safer, more nurtured at her father's home. Liam, still too young to articulate deep preferences, had simply remarked he wished his mother wasn't always too busy when he wanted to talk or needed help. Then James stepped forward to speak. With visible emotion, he told the court how, since the divorce, he had reshaped his entire life to revolve around his children. He spoke of adjusting his work schedule to always be there for pickups, of attending every school function, of evenings spent doing homework together and cooking balanced meals. He described a home grounded in consistency, patience, and love. His voice trembled slightly as he shared his fears about the emotional and physical neglect his children faced in Laura's care. "I'm not here to tear my ex-wife down," he said, meeting the judge's gaze with quiet strength. "I'm here because I believe Sophie and Liam deserve better. And I know I can give that to them. They crave stability, attentive guidance, and most importantly, the assurance that they matter. I can give them that." Now it was Laura's opportunity to speak. She approached the witness stand, attempting to justify her actions, though the earlier confidence she carried had visibly faded. With tears in her eyes, she insisted her love for her children was genuine and that any negligence was never intentional. Yes, she admitted, balancing her job with her responsibilities at home hadn't been easy. But she argued that James was distorting the truth, magnifying her faults and downplaying the fact that their kids were healthy and, in her view, doing fine overall. She maintained that their academic performance was generally acceptable, a statement contradicted by the child advocate's report, and pointed out that they were always clothed, fed, and cared for. Encouraged by her attorney, Laura emphasized her long-standing role as the children's primary caregiver, stressing that a change in custody would unsettle their lives. But under cross-examination, her demeanor shifted. She became tense and defensive. James's lawyer carefully reviewed the incidents on record, one by one. "Mrs. Miller," he began, "is it accurate that your children missed dental appointments last year? Because you forgot to book them, and that Mr. Miller had to step in and reschedule when he discovered this?" A flush crept into Laura's face. I was overwhelmed that week. It was an honest mistake." "And what about the parent-teacher meeting about Sophie's declining grades?" "Neither you nor Mr. Thompson showed up. Mr. Miller had to meet with the teacher alone, correct?" Laura muttered something about a work obligation, but it lacked conviction. The most damaging exchange came when James's attorney asked her plainly, "Miss Miller, would you say that since the divorce, your personal life, your romantic relationships, social outings, and so forth, have at times come before your responsibilities as a mother?" Laura stiffened. "No, I don't believe that's true. I've always ensured my children were taken care of. Even when that care came from babysitters or extended family while you were away," the attorney pushed. A flicker of irritation crossed Laura's features. "Parents are allowed to get help." "That doesn't make me unfit," the judge interjected in a calm voice. "No one is suggesting you're a bad mother, Miss Miller. Our focus here is what custody arrangement serves the children's best interests. Please respond to the questions directly." Laura lowered her gaze and fell silent, unable to mount a strong rebuttal against the detailed documentation and concerns presented. During closing statements, Laura's attorney implored the court not to let a handful of missteps overshadow years of parenting, while James's counsel emphasized the consistent patterns of neglect and the children's need for a more stable environment. The judge called a short recess to consider the case. When everyone returned, tension hung thick in the air. James sat with his hands locked so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Laura appeared pale, her eyes glistening as she tried to hold back tears. Derek, seated quietly in the back row, stared fixedly at the floor. When the judge re-entered, she didn't take long. Citing the weight of the evidence and the overarching concern for the children's well-being, she granted James primary custody of Sophie and Liam. His child support responsibilities were ended immediately. She also noted that Laura's improved financial stability and housing situation justified a substantial reduction in alimony, ordering that it would phase out completely in 6 months. There was a stunned hush across the courtroom. James shut his eyes as a flood of relief and emotion surged through him. "It's over, I won." Tears welled in his eyes, threatening to spill. A soft sob shattered the silence. Laura trembled at her table, gripping its edge. Derek reached out, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. She shook him off and buried her face in her hands. The judge formalized the new custody schedule and brought the session to a close. James remained frozen in his seat, barely able to register the words. Then a small hand slid into his. He looked down. Liam was there beside him. Melanie had quietly ushered the children in as the verdict was being delivered. On his other side stood Sophie, her face lit with cautious joy, her eyes glistening not with sorrow but something closer to relief. "It's okay, Dad," Liam whispered, as though comforting him. James let out a shaky breath and pulled both kids close, holding them in a tight embrace, right there in front of everyone. "It's more than okay," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "We're going to be together now." Sophie leaned back just a little and looked up at him, wide-eyed. "We get to live with you?" she asked, her voice tentative, like she needed to hear it from him to believe it was real. "Yes," James said, smiling through his tears. "Yes, we do. You're coming home with me." The words hung in the air like a promise. Sophie let out a soft breath that was part laugh, part relief, and wrapped her arms tightly around him. "I'm so happy," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion as she clung to James. "I missed home." Liam, barely old enough to grasp the gravity of what had happened, bounced with joy, picking up on the energy around him. James bent to lift his son, pressing a kiss to his forehead before pulling Sophie close with his other arm. Just across the aisle, Laura slowly stood, her face a mask of disbelief. Her cheeks were wet with tears, and her expression made it clear she hadn't expected to lose. James caught her gaze for a split second as he moved toward the exit with both children. She opened her mouth, perhaps to speak, but no sound emerged. In return, James gave her a faint nod, restrained, almost weary. There was no triumph in his eyes, only the quiet recognition of a bitter conclusion. She had fought with ruthless determination, but in the end, her choices had spoken louder than any argument she could make. Without a backward glance, James guided Sophie and Liam through the courtroom doors, leaving Laura and Derek behind. The afternoon sun bathed them in warmth as they stepped into the world outside. Sophie reached for James's hand, her grip firm. Liam skipped ahead, animatedly describing how he wanted to decorate his new bedroom at Dad's house. In that moment, James felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. 2 years ago, he had entered this same building defeated, a man shattered by betrayal. Today, he left whole, his children by his side. As they approached his car, Sophie turned suddenly and hugged him again. "I love you, Dad," she murmured. "I love you too, sweetheart," he replied, pressing a kiss to her hair. He looked at the two of them, his children finally home and safe. His eyes welled with emotion, but these were tears of joy. "We're going to be okay," he said quietly. "All of us." And for the first time in a long while, he truly believed it. Chapter 6. The Balance Shifts. The weeks after the custody decision felt like waking up from a long nightmare. The house that had once echoed with silence now pulsed with laughter, footsteps, and the comfort of daily life. Sophie and Liam adjusted to their new routines with surprising ease. Sophie's grades soared under the steady rhythm of stability, and James's nightly help with homework. Liam, once prone to anxious spells, began to thrive, his spirit light and free in a home that finally felt like one. Often, James would catch himself mid-task, stirring a pot on the stove while Sophie laid out plates and Liam snuck treats to the dog they'd recently adopted, and marvel at how far they had come. For the first time in what felt like ages, he felt content. He had reclaimed what mattered most, a peaceful home, filled with love. But not everything was behind him. There was still one unresolved piece of the past: Derek Thompson. Derek had not only betrayed him on a personal level, but had stood shoulder to shoulder with Laura in her attempt to take everything from him. James could have left it there, focused only on the victory. But a quiet, burning part of him knew that some debts needed to be paid. Late one night after the kids had gone to bed, James sat at his desk, laptop open and mind sharp. Over the past year, he'd quietly assembled a file, documentation of Derek's shady dealings, whistleblower emails, altered financial records, even an incriminating phone recording Carl had managed to capture. It was enough to raise serious alarms. With calm precision, James drafted a series of anonymous tips. One went to Derek's company board, outlining evidence of fraud and manipulation. Another to 2 major clients, complete with documentation that strongly suggested they had been overcharged and misled. He used a secure, untraceable email and routed everything through layers of privacy tools. There would be no connection back to him. Once satisfied, he hit send. The rest was out of his hands. The truth would do what it was meant to do. The repercussions came swiftly. At first, just whispers. Industry rumors that Derek's company was launching an internal review. James, still working in finance, caught the news through casual conversations and forwarded articles. One business blog speculated that a regional sales manager had been suspended over financial misconduct. Though no names were mentioned, James knew exactly who they meant. Soon the speculation turned to confirmation. Derek's company released a formal statement. Derek Thompson was no longer employed there, effective immediately. No public explanation was offered, but the subtext was clear. Within days, one of Derek's major clients filed a lawsuit citing fraud. His professional world, once secure and smug, was crumbling. Then, one afternoon, as James wrapped up work from his home office, a routine he kept to be present when the kids came home, his phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar. He hesitated, then answered. It was Derek. And he was furious. "So you think you're real smart, huh?" Derek's voice surged through the phone, thick with hostility. "I know it was you, James. Who else would stoop this low?" A steady stillness settled over James. Cold. Controlled. He stepped onto the back patio in silence, making sure he was far from where the kids were upstairs finishing their homework. "I don't know what you're accusing me of," he said in an even unreadable tone. "Cut the crap," Derek growled. "My career's in the gutter. Don't act clueless. You just couldn't handle seeing me and Laura together. So now that you've got the kids, you're coming for everything else?" His fury practically spilled through the speaker. As Derek ranted, James found himself momentarily pulled into a memory. A summer afternoon, Derek laughing beside him at a barbecue, clapping him on the back, calling him brother over shared beers. That version of Derek felt like a stranger now. When Derek paused, perhaps waiting for retaliation, James responded, his voice quiet, but sharp enough to cut glass. "Let's be clear about one thing, Derek. You burned this house down long before I ever lifted a finger. You chose to sleep with my wife. You decided you had some right to step into my life, my family, and you ran your business like a fraud. What's happening to you now? That's not my doing. That's just your mess finally catching up with you." Silence stretched out across the line. When Derek finally spoke again, his tone had shifted. The venom was gone, replaced by something unsteady, almost pleading. "You won," he said. "You've got the kids. You got what you wanted. Why couldn't you just leave it there? You're going to bankrupt me, James. I could be facing charges." His voice trembled with the beginnings of panic. James closed his eyes, not from empathy, but to steel himself. "I don't owe you a damn thing," he said, each word cold and deliberate. "You didn't blink when you and Laura tried to destroy me. Remember? She wanted the house, the money, my time with my children. And you? You sat in that courtroom beside her, smug as hell." Derek said nothing. His silence was all the confirmation James needed. "I didn't fabricate a single thing about you," James continued, his voice low but firm. "I just made sure the truth reached the people who had a right to hear it. If that truth ruins you, well, that's on your shoulders. Don't ever contact me again." With that, he ended the call. His hand shook slightly as he lowered the phone. He lingered outside for a while, inhaling the crisp evening air. There was no satisfaction, no triumph in his chest. Only a cold finality. Derek had orchestrated his own downfall, and now he would face it alone. In the weeks that followed, word spread quickly. Under professional disgrace and mounting pressure, Derek vanished from the city, hoping for a clean slate somewhere far away. But with his collapse came another, the unraveling of his romance with Laura. Through a mutual acquaintance, James later heard that Derek had become moody, volatile. The strain had eroded whatever affection remained. After a series of explosive outbursts, it all ended in a brutal argument. Derek walked out, slamming the door behind him, for good. The man Laura had upended her life for left her in the rubble. Without Derek's income and support, Laura's carefully constructed world began to crumble. The high-end SUV was the first to go, repossessed. Then came the calls from creditors. The extravagant spending sprees and regular salon visits ended abruptly. With bills piling up and alimony slashed to a fraction of what it had been, she was forced to sell the spacious 5-bedroom home. On her own, she couldn't keep up the mortgage. The fantasy had collapsed, completely. She relocated to a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the opposite side of town, something she could afford with her income from part-time design gigs and a new position at a home decor shop. James kept track of these changes from a respectful distance. He took no satisfaction in Laura's struggles, especially knowing their children were caught in the upheaval. On the contrary, he made it a point to soften the blow for Sophie and Liam as best he could. When Laura broke down while telling him about the move and explained that the kids wouldn't have their individual rooms anymore, James stepped in. He brought Sophie and Liam shopping for bedding and decorations to personalize the space they'd now be sharing at their mom's smaller place. He reminded them gently that a home wasn't about square footage or rooms, it was wherever love lived. One evening, during their usual custody handoff at a neutral location, Laura approached James hesitantly. She looked worn, thinner than before, simply dressed, her once polished nails now bare. As the kids climbed into James's vehicle, she cleared her throat. "James, can we talk for a minute?" He paused mid-motion, just about to get into the driver's seat, and stepped aside with her. "Sure," he said. Up close, her eyes were ringed with red. She seemed to wrestle with her words. I wanted to say thank you." James blinked, momentarily unsure he'd heard her right. "Thank me?" She nodded, her throat working as she swallowed. "For not poisoning the kids against me. For letting me be in their lives." She looked down. "You didn't have to, but you did." "I know I didn't earn that kindness." James studied her face. There was no trace of manipulation, only sincerity and regret. "They need both of us," he said at last. "I would never take them from you. I just needed to know they were safe." A faint, tired smile appeared on her lips. "They are. With you. They're doing well, and I'm glad. They're lucky to have you." James didn't know what to say. This was a far cry from the furious, vengeful woman who had once promised to ruin him. "Take care of yourself, Laura," he said after a pause. It wasn't quite forgiveness, but it was spoken with honesty. She gave a small nod. As he turned to walk away, she called out quietly, "You're a good man, James." He glanced back, and for the first time in many years, he glimpsed a flicker of the woman he had once loved. There was something softer in her expression now, a humility shaped by difficult lessons and regret. On the drive home, with Sophie chatting in the back seat and Liam already dozing off, James felt an unexpected pang of compassion for her. In 2 short years, Laura had watched her carefully built world unravel. Her marriage, her comfort, even the affair she'd thought worth everything. Now she was picking up the pieces from the bottom, much like he once had. But where James had managed to rebuild something sturdier from the rubble, Laura was still trying to find her ground. Later that night, after tucking Liam into bed and saying goodnight to Sophie, who was busy messaging friends, James sank into the living room couch. His thoughts drifted. The fire that had once driven him to seek retribution had finally died out. Derek was long gone. Laura had faced the consequences of her actions. Most importantly, Sophie and Liam were safe and thriving. The bitterness that had consumed him was now little more than a shadow. In its place grew a quiet determination to live well and to move forward. It hit him then. He had done what he set out to do. He had kept his family safe. He had rebuilt his life. The chapter driven by anger had closed. A new one was beginning, quiet, tender, full of slow healing, and maybe even new love on the horizon. He wasn't entirely sure what the future held, but for the first time he felt ready to meet it. Chapter 7. Fresh Starts. In the following year, James's life eased into a steady, joyful rhythm. The chaos of the past gradually gave way to peace, and the wounds began to mend, replaced by laughter, growth, and new memories. It was during this season of calm that James met Angela. It happened one sunny Saturday morning in the park. James had brought Sophie and Liam to a local tree planting event, a volunteer project that mirrored the values he hoped to pass on to them. Angela was one of the coordinators for the event, a striking woman in her late 30s, always quick to smile and laugh. She connected effortlessly with the children, crouching beside Liam to show him how to gently press the earth around a young tree, and praising Sophie for her skilled use of the shovel. When James joined in, muddy and slightly winded, Angela flashed a grin. "You've got some real go-getters there," she said, nodding toward the kids. "They're pretty amazing," James answered, pride glowing in his smile. As they took breaks for water and chatted in between tasks, they began to learn bits and pieces about each other. Angela mentioned she worked as a guidance counselor at a high school nearby, which made sense. She clearly had a way with young people. She also shared that she was single having recently come out of a painful breakup and spent many weekends involved in local volunteer work. James was drawn to her perspective, realistic but full of hope. There was something quietly resilient about her, something that made him feel at ease. After that afternoon, he caught himself thinking about her often, and it turned out she'd been thinking of him too. A week later, she called to ask if he'd be interested in helping out at a tree care workshop, and that call led to coffee. A few days after, they had dinner together. The conversation flowed naturally. James spoke about Sophie and Liam and carefully revealed fragments of his past. He briefly mentioned a rough divorce, but avoided diving into the painful details right away. Angela, in turn, told stories from her college days and her deep commitment to helping students through her work. As the months went by, their connection grew stronger. Angela became a calm, comforting presence in James's world, a well of empathy and strength. She never pressured him to share more than he was ready for. But over time, little by little, James confided in her. He told her everything about Laura's betrayal, the bitterness of the divorce, the exhausting custody battle, and even his own role in what happened with Derek. Part of him feared that laying it all out might scare her off, but Angela met his truth with only tenderness. One evening, after he'd finished recounting the whole painful saga, Angela's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. She gently reached for his hand. "You've been through so much," she said quietly. "But you're still here, kind, loyal, and stronger than ever. That speaks volumes about the man you are." In that moment, James realized something unexpected. He loved her. After all the betrayal, after thinking he'd never open his heart again, he knew. Angela brought light back into a part of his life he thought had gone dark for good. She reminded him that healing was possible, not just surviving, but finding real joy again. Sophie and Liam warmed to Angela right away, which came as both a relief and a quiet blessing to James. Angela never tried to take on the role of mother or force her way into their routines. She was simply present, showing up to Liam's soccer games with homemade snacks, helping Sophie rehearse her debate speeches, joining them for family game nights. James often found himself marveling at how naturally she fit into their lives. She treated the kids with warmth and respect, and they responded with affection and trust. One crisp autumn day, James and Angela took the kids on a hike just outside the city. As Sophie and Liam wandered ahead, kicking at piles of red and gold leaves, Angela reached for James's hand. "You look happy," she said, her gaze soft and sincere. James looked at her, then smiled. "I am," he said. For the first time in what felt like forever, he genuinely was. The past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer weighed him down. His life had begun to fill with purpose again, with connection, with love. About a year into their relationship, something unexpected happened. Laura called. She asked if they could meet for coffee. Just the two of them. It was out of the ordinary. Since the custody arrangement had shifted, their communication had been limited to brief, polite exchanges during pickups or occasional texts about schedules. James felt a flicker of anxiety, but also curiosity, and agreed. They met on a quiet Sunday afternoon at a little cafe downtown. James arrived first and chose a table tucked in the corner. He wasn't sure what emotions would surface, seeing Laura alone like this, with no children or court proceedings between them. But when she walked in, he felt unexpectedly steady. Laura approached slowly, offering a hesitant smile. She looked tired, a bit frayed around the edges, but there was a gentleness to her that he hadn't seen in a long time. "Hi, James," she said softly. "Hi, Laura," he replied. They sat down. For a while, neither of them spoke, just stirred their coffee, caught in a moment of quiet uncertainty. Finally, Laura drew in a shaky breath. "Thank you for meeting me," she began. "There's a lot I need to say." James didn't interrupt. He waited, giving her the space to find her words. Her eyes brimmed, and she blinked rapidly. "First, I need to apologize. I know I've said I'm sorry before, but I don't think I've ever really said it." Her voice trembled. I'm so sorry for everything I did to you, to us, to our family. Her throat tightened. Cheating on you with Derek. The way I acted during the divorce, trying to take it all away from you. It was awful. I was awful. You didn't earn even a fraction of what I put you through. James gave a slow, thoughtful nod. He'd heard apologies like this before, versions of them at least, but never quite this plainly, this sincerely. Thank you for saying that, he replied. I did forgive you. Not right away, but eventually. I had to, for myself and for the kids. Holding on to that anger, it was just tearing me up. Laura's eyes welled and a single tear slipped down her cheek. You really forgave me, she whispered, her voice raw with disbelief. In my heart, yes, James said gently. I'll never forget what happened. But the hate, I had to let it go. It wasn't doing me any good, it was only hurting the people I care about. Laura dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, trying to hold herself together. You've always been more than I deserved, she said, her breath catching. I also wanted to say thank you for everything since then. You never tried to turn Sophie or Liam against me. You let me stay in their lives. A lot of dads wouldn't have after what I did. But you even encouraged them to spend time with me. I know you did that for them, not for me, but still. It means everything. Thank you. James looked away for a moment, moved and unsure of how to respond. They need their mom, he said quietly. I'd never keep them from you unless they weren't safe. And I can tell you're really trying now. I respect that. Laura gave a small, trembling smile at his words. She toyed with her coffee cup, hands unsteady, summoning the nerve for what she needed to say next. I need to ask you something, she said, her voice hesitant. Even if it's too late, even if it's selfish. She looked up at him, her eyes searching. Is there any chance at all? For us? For us to be a family again? Under one roof? Though James had seen this coming, the question still struck him. He could see the vulnerability behind it. How difficult it was for her to even say aloud. Before he could respond, she continued quickly, as if afraid silence would mean rejection. I know I don't have the right to ask. I know I destroyed everything. But watching you with the kids, seeing how whole and joyful you all seem, it made me realize exactly what I lost. What I threw away. I know it might be foolish, but I needed to ask. Is there even the smallest chance you could love me again? That we could rebuild what we had? Tears were falling steadily now, her voice cracking under their weight. James swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He reached across the table, taking her hand. A gesture of comfort and a way to steady himself. Laura, he said gently, I care about you. You're the mother of my children, and I truly want you to find peace and happiness. But us? He paused, voice soft. That part of our story is over. Laura shut her eyes, another tear splashing onto his hand. Too much happened, James continued. Too many things were broken between us. And the trust we lost, I can't get it back. To be honest, I don't want to try. I've moved on. I'm not in the same place anymore. She opened her eyes again, blinking slowly. There's someone else, isn't there? She asked, voice barely audible. Sophie mentioned someone, Angela? James gave a faint smile at the name. Yes, Angela. We've been seeing each other for a while now. It wasn't something I planned, but I love her. And the kids really care about her too. She's amazing. Laura took that in quietly, wiping her tears. I'm glad, she said, and despite the heartache behind her words, she seemed to truly mean it. I'm happy you found someone who sees your worth. Thank you, James said, giving her hand a gentle squeeze before letting go. I hope you understand, he added. I can't be who you're looking for anymore, but I'll always be here as your friend and as your co-parent. We have Sophie and Liam. We both love them deeply. That's something that will never change. Laura managed a shaky smile. That really means a lot, she said. More than I probably deserve. She paused, inhaling slowly as she gathered herself. I had a feeling what your answer would be, but I still needed to ask, maybe just to ease my own mind. I understand, James replied, his voice low and warm. And I'm glad you asked. That took bravery. Laura let out a soft, uneven laugh. Not nearly as much as it took for you to get through what I put you through. I'm truly sorry, James. I hope someday you can completely forgive me. Not for my sake, so you don't have to carry the weight of what I did. I've already forgiven you, James said gently. Whatever pain lingered, time has a way of softening the sharp edges if you let it. I've built a good life now. I'm happy. And I want the same for you, Laura. Truly. Her eyes welled again, but she blinked the tears away. You've changed so much, she whispered. Or maybe this is who you always were and I just never saw it. You're a good man, James. The best I've ever known. A flicker of old fondness stirred in him. Not love, not anymore, but a quiet compassion for the woman she once was. Take care of yourself, he said with heartfelt sincerity. If you keep doing right by the kids and by yourself, things will turn around. She gave a small nod. A few more words were exchanged, polite and careful, and then it was clear. It was time to part. They stood sharing a brief, gentle hug. It wasn't romantic, but it carried something deeper. An unspoken agreement of forgiveness and a peaceful goodbye. Goodbye, James, Laura whispered. Goodbye, Laura, he replied, stepping back. He watched as she walked away. Her shoulders curled slightly against the cool air. In that moment, something between them ended. Finally, fully. There were no lingering doubts, no unspoken wounds left to fester. James felt something lift from his chest. A burden he hadn't realized was still there. Later that night at home, he sat on the porch swing beside Angela, telling her about what had happened. Her hand rested quietly in his as she listened. When he finished, she studied his face. You okay? She asked softly. He took a moment before answering, then nodded. Yeah, it was difficult in some ways, but I feel free now, like I finally let it go. Angela offered a gentle smile. I'm proud of you. It takes strength to forgive like that. James slid an arm around her, pulling her close. The evening was cool, but her closeness warmed him more than any blanket could. I couldn't have gotten here without everything that's helped me. You, the kids, even the pain I had to walk through. It all changed me. And maybe it had to. Angela leaned up and kissed his cheek. You deserve joy, James. All of it. From inside, the sound of laughter floated out. Sophie and Liam giggling over a video before bedtime. James looked through the porch screen at the soft glow coming from the living room. That light, that laughter. This was his world now. Honest, hard-earned, overflowing with love. On the mantel in that room sat a new photo of their family. James stood in the center, Sophie at one side and Liam at the other, all three beaming. Angela leaned into the frame beside them, Liam's arm thrown casually over her shoulder, Sophie's hand tucked in hers. The joy on their faces wasn't posed. It was real. A bond built not from perfection, but from truth, from endurance, and from love. It wasn't the flawless family James once thought he had, but it was something far better, something genuine. He glanced at Angela, then back at the warm glow where their children sat. A deep pride swelled in him. The illusion of happiness he'd once clung to was gone. In its place stood something lasting. He hadn't just survived the betrayal. He'd built something stronger because of it, and he was happier than he'd ever been.